In 1980, I was invited to become president of World Wildlife Fund International. In that capacity, I was persuaded to give the Fairfield Osborn Memorial Lecture for the New York Zoological Society in the Avery Fisher Hall in New York. I chose the title Clashes of Interest because even though the conservation of nature is important for everyone in the long run, some interests are bound to be threatened in the short term, and this inevitably causes conflict. I was fortunate enough to be able to attend the inaugural dinner in New York at the launching of the United States National Appeal of the World Wildlife Fund in 1962. I cannot now remember all the details, but I do remember getting into diplomatic hot water for suggesting that a certain country with a vast and rapidly expanding population did not really need the assistance of the products of rhinoceros horns for certain natural functions. As it happens, the poor rhinos ran into another problem, finding their horns in great demand for making handles for ceremonial daggers in certain parts of the Arabian Peninsula. It is instances such as these, and there are any number of them, which are liable to turn otherwise calm and sensible conservationists into militant fanatics. This is unfortunate for two reasons. First, because anger usually makes people rude and insulting, and that is certainly not the way to win friends and influence people. And secondly, anger makes people thrash out blindly in all directions, so that if they actually succeed in making any impression at all, it's more by good luck than by good judgment. Many people seem to think that the conservation of nature can be achieved quite simply and easily. To them, it's just a matter of stopping greedy industrialists, preventing the killing of any wild animals, and turning all forests and wilderness areas into national parks. It may be easy enough to put it like that, but to carry such a plan into operation is a practical impossibility. In anything to do with conservation, I believe it's particularly important to keep cool, read the World Conservation Strategy, think deeply, and be particularly careful to identify the interests of the people and groups most directly involved. It is then a matter of dealing with each situation in the most appropriate and effective way. Uncompromising confrontation may work sometimes, but any reasonably intelligent person is more likely to respond to explanation and a well-argued case for conservation. However, before you can make the case, it's vitally important to have a clear conception of the purpose and therefore of the priorities of conservation. We all claim to be concerned about conservation, but the word means different things to different people. Some are more interested in the conservation of the human and built environment. Others take it to mean the conservation of nature and the natural environment. And since man is a part of nature, certain issues and situations are common to both. But while it is reasonable to worry about the human environment and desirable to try to create a satisfactory state of existence for ourselves and for those animals and plants which serve our needs, the conservation of the wild forms of life and of the wilderness areas which constitute the natural environment is a rather more difficult issue. The problem arises because in the majority of cases involving the conservation of nature, it is the activities of particular people which pose the greatest threat to nature, and consequently a balance has to be struck between their interests and the claims of the natural world. But much as some people would like, it is really not possible to prevent every instance of human interference with the natural environment or every case of the exploitation of wild populations. It may well be distasteful to kill baby seals, but provided the species as a whole, or any branch of it, is not threatened with extinction itself, or is threatening the extinction of another species, it is not a conservation problem. It may be a moral problem, but it cannot, for example, rate a higher priority than the protection of a species from extinction. Even if the threat to the survival of a species is posed by such morally less offensive activities as drainage schemes, commercial fishing, or the cropping of forest areas. Although the ordinary processes of nature have long-term effects on wildlife and the natural environment, by far the most immediately damaging effects are caused by human activities. The point to bear in mind is that all human activities have their origin in the decisions of individuals or groups of individuals. It is also worth remembering that these activities are seldom motivated by malice, vindictiveness, or cruelty towards nature. Nearly always the damaging consequences of the activities derive from ignorance, self-interest, thoughtlessness, or simple irresponsibility. Detached and analytical intellectuals tend to rationalize the whole thing by saying that someone or something called man is responsible for all the problems. How often one hears enraged conservationists talking about man being greedy, irresponsible, self-indulgent, or guilty of any other sin they care to mention. I have to admit that I've done it myself. It's so easy to pick on man as the culprit. It sounds rather grand and impressive. But in reality, the expression man is a convenient but meaningless generalization. Lumping the world's 4 billion people into one category is patently absurd. And if the term is used to include all men who have ever lived, it is even more ridiculous. It seems to me that as conservationists we need to be a great deal more realistic about human behavior and human emotions, reactions and prejudices. Not everyone has the same characteristics, but people can be expected to respond in certain ways to certain stimuli. One of the most difficult tasks you can attempt is to get someone to accept your point of view and to act on your advice without the use of force or other pressure. Taking human nature into account is for us of the utmost importance because, in the final analysis, nature is at risk through the conflict of human interests. Although ignorance is not strictly speaking a characteristic of human nature, ignorance of nature is certainly a characteristic of most people and the cause of a great deal of the trouble. It's easy enough to say that adults ought to know better. If you come to think of it, every child is born literally ignorant, and what is more, there is a new crop of them every year, of which an increasing proportion will be born and brought up in cities. It is true that they all have instincts and talents, but these are not much use to them until they acquire some knowledge and experience. It is quite unrealistic to suppose that children growing up in an urban situation will acquire the same knowledge of the natural environment as children growing up in the country. When the children from the poorer districts of London were evacuated to the country at the beginning of the last war, it was said that many of them refused to drink milk which they had seen coming from a cow, because they believed that the real stuff only came out of bottles. This is an extreme case, but many bright and intelligent city children go on to become managers, leaders in their professions and creators of opinions, and if they remain ignorant of the basic concepts of conservation, it will only be a matter of time before they find themselves in conflict with their better-informed fellow citizens. Once upon a time it might have been an idea to appeal to parents to give their children the facts about our natural environment and to try to make it possible for them to be exposed to the grandeur, the beauty and the awesomeness of nature. Not in some flabby romantic sense, but in both its harsh and tender reality. Unfortunately, in this modern, enlightened world, the experts seem to discourage the idea that parents should have any responsibility for the education of their children. One English headmaster was recently reported as saying, "I'm not sure that parents know what is best educationally for their children. They know what's best for them to eat. They know the best environment they can provide at home. But we've been trained to ascertain the problems of children," and so on. However, judging by the appalling ignorance of so many people about the processes of nature and the frightening, but usually unintentional damage being done to the natural environment, it does seem that the professional teachers, psychiatrists and sociologists who control education in these days are not particularly interested in the principles of conservation. A deer stalker recently said to me that he had come to the conclusion that the more people were educated, the less common sense they seemed to have. He then told me of the 2 students who went climbing in the winter in the hills near his home in Scotland without telling anyone where they were going. 4 days later he found them dead from exposure. If people are sufficiently ignorant to allow nature to kill them, it's hardly to be expected that they will understand the principles of conservation. This same sort of ignorance is capable of putting the whole future of our world at risk. As Fairfield Osborn saw so clearly, the greatest threat to the future of the Earth is the unchecked human population explosion. And this is likely to increase the number of living people from 4 billion today to an estimated 6 billion by the year 2000 on a planet which has no prospects of increasing its size to accommodate them. Some might argue that man, and presumably woman in this case, was being guilty of gross irresponsibility. That is obviously not true, because a great many parents are highly responsible, and furthermore, fortunately perhaps, there are a large number of people who have no children at all. The trouble is that there are so many females of breeding age who are either ignorant or irresponsible, or sometimes both ignorant and irresponsible, and so many men to encourage them to be irresponsible. But before anyone jumps to conclusions, let me say at once that I'm not discussing the morality of contraception. I'm merely drawing attention to the obvious fact that if only 90% of all female children born alive survive to breeding age and then have more than 2 or 3 children each, it can only feed the population explosion. This is a classic case of a conflict of interest between individual parents, who naturally feel entitled to have as many children as they please, and the world at large, which patently will not be able to support a natural world as well as to feed and house a vastly inflated human population. Paradoxically, it has been the success of the medical and agricultural sciences which has made the population explosion possible. It's one of the laws of nature that any population will increase to consume food and the space available unless checked by disease or famine. The conflict arises because, while everyone with the slightest spark of humanity clamours for more food to feed the growing number of undernourished people, conservationists are loud in their protest about modern farming methods and the reclamation of wilderness areas for agriculture. But attacking agriculture is rather like blaming man again. Who identifies with agriculture? It's an abstract concept. Useful may be for economists and for civil servants and scientists who work in government departments of agriculture, but I doubt whether farmers and landowners feel that it applies to them personally. And I'm quite certain that the very large number of peasant and subsistence farmers in the Third World are completely unaware of the argument anyway. In any case, farmers have their own conflict of interest to resolve. They have to farm for profit, or to put it the other way, they obviously cannot afford to farm at a loss. Therefore, they are unlikely to be sympathetic to any form of wildlife which in fact, or in their belief, is likely to reduce their yields. Some farmers and officials of ministries of agriculture have to cope with more subtle conflicts. For instance, scientific investigation has established that wild badgers in England and wild opossums in New Zealand are liable to infection by the bovine tubercle bacillus, and in their turn they are known to spread tuberculosis to domestic cattle. The disease can then be passed on to the human population through the cow's milk, although pasteurization has greatly reduced the risk. It is, of course, fairly easy to control the disease in cattle by the simple expedient of slaughtering the infected animals. Strangely enough, this raises no protest, presumably because they are domestic animals. However, it is an expensive method, and not unnaturally farmers get a bit discouraged when their herds are constantly reinfected and liable to slaughter. But what to do about the wild badgers and opossums? A similar policy of eradication by slaughter is hotly opposed by protection societies, even though it would also benefit both the wild species in the long run. Indeed, both badgers and opossums are at greater risk of decimation by the further spread of tuberculosis throughout their populations than by a policy of slaughtering the various pockets of population suffering from the disease. It is not that farmers do not understand the principle of conservation. After all, they practice it all the time. They have to keep back seed and breeding stock for next year's production. They have to provide a habitat for their stock, and they have to feed it. In fact, many of them take a lot of trouble to make life possible for a large number of wild creatures without great cost to themselves, and at the same time they make their farms that much more interesting and satisfactory places to live on. There are any number of examples in many parts of the world of farmers who do just that and still manage to thrive economically. Much the same applies to foresters in the developed countries. Of course, some animals are a nuisance, and any species can become a pest if its population gets too big, but there is a great difference between trying to exterminate a pest and learning to live with a nuisance. But the conflict of interest becomes much more intense in the so-called developing countries. To the eyes of the conservationists, the great natural rainforests are objects of beauty and delight, and the habitat of a vast range of plant and animal life. They are also vital components of the world's climatic conditions and the carbon dioxide oxygen cycle. But to the government of these countries, struggling with internal hunger, poverty and unemployment, with external debt and with a plethora of well-meaning advisers and foreign aid programs, the forests represent wealth in a fairly easily convertible form. Anyone who feels like persuading them otherwise must proceed with caution and much tact. The conflict between cash and conservation also extends into the wildlife of many developing countries. Horns, tusks, skins and meat are all tempting resources for poachers, and particularly in situations of political instability or government lethargy, cash wins fairly easily. Furthermore, it's no use believing that the designation of national parks and the introduction of legislation will necessarily solve the problem. Unless the parks are properly managed and the legislation effectively enforced, little significant conservation is achieved. A rather different conflict exists in the development of other forms of natural resources. Water, in particular, seems to have the most extraordinary effect on engineers. They either want to keep it in dams and reservoirs, or they want to drain it away to the sea as quickly as possible. The single-mindedness with which hydroelectric engineers, municipal water supply engineers, irrigation and drainage engineers go about their business is most impressive, and I am quite sure that they do not set about their work with the sole intention of destroying the natural environment and removing the habitat of wild species. It's not that they just do not care, it's simply that many of them do not know, and a little politely offered information is more likely to have an effect than a military confrontation. After all, they're just as capable of understanding the value of conservation as any of us. 10 years ago, the River Thames in London was virtually lifeless. Today, it's once again being used by migratory fish and much other wildlife. This rehabilitation of a severely polluted waterway stands as a good example of what can be achieved at quite modest cost by understanding and cooperation between conservationists and various specialist engineers. The difficulty is that engineers have to reconcile the demands of their communities with the needs of nature, and that is not at all easy when angry rate and taxpayers are demanding service for their money. As a matter of fact, I would not be at all surprised if the same people who complained about inadequate water supplies and sewage services are also devoted conservationists giving both time and money to persuading man, or perhaps agriculture, to mend their ways. In these days of threatened energy shortages, it is tempting to suggest that more power should be produced from sources of ambient energy, such as windmills, solar collectors, and further hydroelectric developments. Some of the schemes might be quite harmless, and some even beneficial to the natural environment, but others could be extremely damaging. It is impossible to generalize, and in the end, the decisions will depend on the good sense and judgment of the individual engineers and administrators responsible for the generation of energy. But their good sense and their judgment would be vastly improved if they had a greater understanding of and sympathy for the problems of nature. They therefore need at some stage to be made aware of the damage their developments are capable of inflicting on ecosystems and habitats. One of the most potent threats to wildlife is pollution. Well, we all know that, but it's no good leaving it at that. Human activities produce many different kinds of effluents, but not all of them are dangerous to all forms of wildlife in every case. In fact, pollution, in the sense that an effluent into the water or into the air or into the earth causes damage to plant or animal species, has a greater variety of causes and effects than any other of the major man-made threats to the natural environment. It can be anything from untreated human sewage discharged into a river to a highly toxic chemical waste discharged from some industrial process. It is its immense range and the general ignorance of the subject which makes pollution so difficult to control, and unless each case is considered within its particular parameters, I really do not believe it will be possible to make much useful progress in coping with the problems. The waste and sewage disposal authorities have to resolve a particularly awkward conflict of interest. Their problem is that treatment costs money, and no elected body ever wants to ask for more money than the community believes to be absolutely necessary. And if the community is unaware of the dangers of discharging untreated sewage into the rivers or estuaries, it is unlikely to press local governments to spend money on treatment works. The inhabitants of the smaller, more rural communities live rather more closely to these mundane affairs and are consequently more likely to appreciate the problems than people living in the great metropolitan conurbations, most of whom are blissfully unaware of the damage caused by the disposal of their wastes and sewage. Furthermore, pollution control is a relatively recent idea and not easily accepted by organizations which have been able to do as they pleased for a great many years. This also applies to many industries, but here again, not all industrial processes produce pollution, and even different companies performing the same processes do not all produce the same amount of pollution. In some situations, the effluents can be discharged without damage, while in other cases, companies, of their own volition, take appropriate measures to prevent their effluent doing any harm. The difficulty today is to identify the particular company which is causing damage, and then to discover which individuals in that company have the necessary authority to take steps to prevent it. Then again, in some cases, these individuals will accept the conservation argument and do something about it. In other cases, they may not be so cooperative. It's therefore important to devise a system which penalizes those responsible for the damage they do, and so provides an incentive to control pollution. As all industrial companies have to live with the market system, there is no reason why the price mechanism should not work in such cases, provided, of course, that a cost can be put on the damage done to wildlife and the natural environment. Even more intractable is the international pollution conflict. The River Rhine is an international waterway flowing through many different countries, each of which supplies its own, and in some cases that means no, pollution control. The power stations on the east coast of Britain have high stacks to carry the effluent clear of the population. However, the prevailing wind is from the southwest, and much of the sulfur dioxide comes down and affects the forests of Sweden. Difficult as it may be to control pollution, it is probably no harder than trying to contain the damaging effects of activities which, performed by individuals on their own, are quite harmless in themselves, but which can cause devastating damage when endlessly repeated by a great many individuals. Recreation is a good example. It's not that any particular individual is responsible for damage. It's simply the cumulative effect of, for instance, large numbers of tourists, which can cause serious disturbance to wild population, the erosion of the land by killing off the vegetation with too many tramping feet, and pollution by litter. The same applies to the taking of game animals and fish, and the collecting of birds' eggs, butterflies, and rare plants. The difficulty about resolving the conflicts in this area is that there are so many individuals involved, and few of them belong to what might be called single communication groups. They do not belong to any particular club or society. They probably do not even read the same newspapers or watch the same television programs. So there is a real problem of getting the conservation message across to them and explaining to them how it is that the cumulative effect of many people indulging in the same activity can adversely affect the natural environment. This is a particularly difficult problem because so many people confuse their appreciation of nature and the wilderness with the conservation of the natural environment. The two, unfortunately, are not synonymous. For one thing, the beginning of conservation is self-restraint, not self-indulgence. The irony is that measures to protect particularly sensitive wilderness areas frequently have the effect of attracting more visitors. It would obviously be desirable, but probably not practical, to restrict entry to such areas to those who are prepared to join a particular organization. This would put them into a single communication group and give them a proprietary interest in the area, and therefore make it possible to influence their behavior. Hunting and fishing for recreation are also activities which in moderation can be harmless, but if pursued to excess, can do really serious damage. It happens that the hunting and fishing laws in the United States enshrine the principle of free-for-all, although there are, of course, bag limits. There is nothing wrong with that. However, it is one thing to say that it is legally free to do something, but that does not mean that it must also be economically free to do it. People are free to form manufacturing companies, but that does not mean to say that those companies should be free to cause damage by discharging dangerous effluents. In principle, there should be an economic inducement to hunters and collectors to conserve the objects of their interest rather than to exploit them. If this cannot be done by allowing them proprietary rights over certain areas, then at least they should be required to become subscribing members of an organization which was itself committed to the conservation of their quarries. Commercial sea fishing provides some good examples of the effect of applying these principles. A few years ago, the waters around Iceland, beyond the 3-mile territorial waters limit, were free for all, and the consequent overfishing reduced the stocks of fish to a dangerously low level. Then, after a considerable struggle and 2 so-called cod wars, Iceland succeeded in gaining proprietorial fishing rights out to 200 miles, and it is now in a position to conserve the stocks in that area. In effect, Iceland now farms those waters, which used to be free for all and consequently exploited without restraint. In the North Sea, almost the reverse took place. The whole of the North Sea was thrown open to the fishermen of all the members of the EEC, just at the time when fishing techniques were becoming increasingly efficient. In consequence, it was overfished, resulting in a severe restriction on the taking of most species of fish and much unemployment among fishermen. In effect, no country has any proprietary rights, and therefore there is no inducement for the fishermen to conserve fish stocks. And apart from the EEC itself, there is no fishing organization to which the fishermen can belong which has the purpose of administering a conservation policy in their interests. Whaling also illustrates the difficulty of reconciling the purely practical issue of the conservation of species from decline and possible extinction with the moral and emotional issue of killing animals. In the case of whales, the technique employed to catch them could hardly be termed humane. In any case, there is inevitably greater sympathy for large animals and what might be termed cuddly animals than for what many consider to be pests and creepy-crawlies. Furthermore, good conservation practice may entail what is termed culling, and this can cause serious conflict between people otherwise devoted to the principles of conservation. Take, for example, the case of the vicuñas in Peru. The scientists working at Pampa Galleras claimed that there were 44,000 of them and that they needed to be culled. However, an aerial survey commissioned by those who thought that they should not be culled put the figure at between 15 and 18,000. In my experience, anyone who tries to restore peace between arguing conservationists usually comes off worst of all. Nevertheless, in spite of all these difficulties, membership organizations and voluntary work are absolutely vital to the conservation movement. The protection or the conservation of nature or care of the environment, whatever you like to call it, is not a new idea. What is new is the vastly increased number of people all over the world who are taking an active interest in it. The world of nature is based on the process of evolution. It may take a very long time to change us genetically, but as we are a thinking species, we are also influenced by the evolution of ideas. The evolution of the conservation idea is giving nature a chance to survive human interference, but it may well also turn out to be one of the most important factors in the survival of the species Homo sapiens itself.